On today's episode, we are joined by Jake Madison, host of the Locked On Pelicans podcast, to talk about Brandon Ingram possibly being available for the Detroit Pistons. We'll talk about all of it in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. And if you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. You'll hear more about FanDuel a little bit later. So we are joined by Jake Madison, host of the Locked On Pelicans podcast. He's one of my favorites over at Locked On. Appreciate you, Jake, for coming on, man. Short notice. Let's have some fun talking Brandon Ingram. So I'm sorry your guys' season ended. That was
you know who kind of ended the season was Brandon Ingram in his play, but I think that's why I'm on here with you to kind of talk about that a little bit here, because look, it's a big question going forward for the team. You know, what are they going to do with BI? How's that going to look? Does he fit with Zion? These are like questions they got to answer. So, you know, a team they could trade him to, like I very much agree, a team that should look at him as a team like the Pistons.
So, and this is going to be, I think, a hot topic throughout the offseason for the Pistons fan base and the community, because this is going to be a very aggressive offseason. It sounds like they have to make moves. They have to change the roster around Cade. His rookie extension's coming up. We know that that's when the clock really starts ticking. It's an important summer for the Pistons. So we're going to be talking all things Brandon Ingram. But the first place I want to start with is, okay, what would a trade look like for Brandon Ingram? Later on, we'll talk about Brandon Ingram, the player, and his fit and what he brings to the table. We'll talk about his contract as well a little later, but let's attack what a trade would look like. I talked with, I'm sorry if I mispronounced his name, but I talked with Shamit on Pelicans Twitter, and he put up a fake trade on Fanspo and pitched it to me, so I tweeted it out and got to see what Pistons fans felt about it. And the trade was Brandon Ingram and the number 21 pick for Jalen Duren and the number 1 overall pick. Now, is that something that you think is close? Do you think that's around what the package would look like? What do you think a trade package for Brandon Ingram would have to look like from the Pistons' perspective?
So the way that you're kind of looking at it, right, is Brandon Ingram and the Pelicans' first-round pick this year for Jalen Duren and the Pistons' first-round pick, essentially, wherever that might land, since it's like we're before the lottery, so we don't necessarily know for sure on some of that, right? Yeah, I think a deal like that the Pelicans would do in a heartbeat, to be perfectly honest with you, especially when you look at around the factors around it. They're not going to trade him just for parts, for pieces, or just to move him. And they're certainly not going to trade him only for picks. It's going to need to be a player that helps them immediately. You and I have actually talked about stuff like this in the past through DMs and things like that, I believe. And, you know, one of the things that can be tough to find a deal when you and I have talked in the past is the Pelicans are trying to win now. You know, they just got swept. It was really disappointing. You have Zion Williamson on that second contract. You just talked about that with Cade. You've got to try and win while these guys are as cheap as possible and get that stuff in place. So the Pelicans aren't going to look for picks for Brandon Ingram to then just try and then go and get what they want. If they're going to move him, it's going to be for a player that can contribute right now. When you look at the Pistons roster, I think that's Jalen Duren. I think they need a center. That's going to be the number one thing they look to try and upgrade for. He's one of the more bright, young, upcoming centers in the league. He fits a lot of what the Pelicans need. That would be the guy that they really look at. I don't know if the Pistons would do a deal like that. I'm kind of curious on your take of that, right? You know, remove Jalen Duren, remove the Pelicans' first-round pick in there, right? Like, would you do Brandon Ingram for your first-round pick, which at worst is what, top 4, basically?
Top 5.
Top 5, and it's a weak draft, so admittedly there's that with it, but that's still a valuable selection.
So where I stand with the answer, it's very interesting because, like you said, this draft is not very strong. And
that's a huge factor into this, I think.
It is. It's a very huge factor. I'm not even, and I think a lot of my listeners, I should clarify myself better on the last podcast. A lot of people are taking this as my opinion on the draft. I have not done my own scouting yet. I have not deep dive into the draft yet. Well, fair enough. But everything I've heard from obviously people like you and people across the league and talking with some beat writers and talking with, people in the know and what the league feels like about the draft, what the Pistons organization feels like about the draft, it's not good. So it's coming from, that's what I'm speaking to, what the league is viewing the draft as. And they don't value this top pick, it seems like. So in a normal draft, if
this was like last year or even next year, I don't think a deal that includes a top 5 pick for Brandon Ingram would get done. This year might be the year where you can do something like that.
Correct, because I think the Pistons are in a move in an offseason, I should say, where they have to make moves and they need to get aggressive to get Cade a star. I've heard that there is somewhat of a understanding of that they need to be aggressive, like from both sides, that they will be aggressive this offseason. So with that being said, because this top pick is in a weaker draft and you don't really want to necessarily, I think, want to add another young guy to a young core that struggled massively last year, if you can move that top pick that's in a weak draft along with somebody that maybe you're looking to replace, it sounds like, and with Nick Claxton or Hardenstein and free agency and Duren, I mean, I think it's interesting because it seems like a lot for Brandon. It seems like a lot in a top pick, but I feel like if you look at the quality of the draft, I don't think it's as crazy as it. I would probably do that trade.
Yeah, it depends on how much you want to compete right away. I think it comes down to that. Like, how much pressure does the Pistons as an organization feel they're under right now? And do they need to make a move that makes you go and at least be, not what you were this past season, right? And Monty Williams has kind of been through this before in New Orleans with the young vet strategy that their former general manager Del Demps did, where you bring guys that are still really young that have proven it. And Brandon Ingram has proven it in the NBA. Like, he's a good player. Right now, I think his value maybe is at an all-time low, given how he played in that playoff series, and there's some questionable fit there with Zion Williamson, but that's more of Zion's such a unique player thing. Brandon Ingram is really good. He's also still really young, and I don't think people even realize that about him, that let me pull it up. He's 26. He'll be 27 next year, right? Like, this is still a young player, like just entering kind of his prime. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. But I think the discussion that we're having right now about like the draft being kind of weak and that fifth, let's put it at the worst case scenario and call it the 5th pick, right? Because that's the worst that it could be here. That 5th pick might be the equivalent of like the 14th, 16th in next year's draft. That's how a lot of people are viewing this sort of thing, that you'd rather, even like a 16th pick in next year's draft isn't like a top 5 picks potentially. It depends on how you view the draft and how you develop guys, and certainly you can do that. But that changes the mindset of this, right? If it was, say, Brandon Ingram in the 21st pick for the 12th pick and Jalen Duren and maybe some other salary, right, to make it work, we're looking at this entirely differently, I think. And we're not looking at the 5th pick. What are you doing? Look at it 12th or later, and I think that kind of changes the calculus on this a little bit.
Right, and I do think that from the Pistons side, if they were to have the number 1 pick, I think maybe they wouldn't do it. I feel like they would want Alex Sarr, but okay. I feel like anything past that, I think that's when things start to open up. So
the other thing with it too is you've got to look at guys that are available, right? We can play fantasy basketball here. It's not 2K. You can't just make a trade if a team doesn't want to trade a player. Look at the names that are gonna potentially get moved this offseason, and who do you want, right? Brandon Ingram is one of them. We'll get into the reality of it and maybe, whether it'll happen or not. And the contract, as you mentioned earlier, is a big factor in this. You got the 2 guards from Atlanta, Trae Young, Dejounte Murray. Like, do you like either of those over Brandon Ingram? Maybe one, maybe not. It just kind of depends. But there's also Cade Cunningham there, right? And how does that fit? Lauri Markkanen's maybe going to be available, right? Is that a better fit? You've got to kind of factor that stuff in. And if it's like, well, we don't like all these other players that are available and Brandon Ingram's the one that's available, yeah, you got to pay to get that guy, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I feel like that's the part people don't really want to do. People don't want to pay for the players that they want. They don't want to give up good stuff to get good players. You can't just get good players for nothing, for trash, basically. So that's always the hardest part when talking about this kind of stuff. So, but yeah, I think the Pistons will have interest in Brandon Ingram, and I said this in the last podcast, they're going to be aggressive. And if at the end of the offseason, if you just simulated this offseason, you told me, the Pistons ended up with Brandon Ingram, I would not be shocked. am I predicting it's going to happen? I'm not saying that, but if you told me it happened, I wouldn't be shocked at all that it ended up happening.
Can I throw a different Pelicans wing at you that I think you guys are going to end up with?
Who?
Oh, Najee Marshall. That's who I think you guys are going to sign.
Me and you've already talked about this before.
You're going to overpay for Najee Marshall, and I can't wait. He's actually an awesome guy. Like good for him, man. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just wanted to throw that out there. Just get a prediction on the record.
I mean, I know the Pistons would absolutely they would absolutely love to get Trey Murphy, but that's way out of the card.
That's not going to happen. Yeah. That's not going to happen.
Like, thank you for saying that on
every team would like to get Trey Murphy, right? Like that's a dude who's 6'10" that shoots threes at a 40% rate and he's getting better all the time.
Thank you for coming on here and saying, like, I still have Pistons fans saying, go get Trey Murphy. He's the wrong wing. I'm like, he's 100% untouchable by the Pelicans.
It's tough, like, when we do these shows, right? Because we have to talk about, like, the realities of situation. Like, yeah, they should go get Trey Murphy. They can't. So what's the point of kind of spending time talking about that? And people maybe are going to be less excited by Brandon Ingram, but like that's the realistic name. And, you know, it's like on my show, I have to talk about the luxury tax and things. The Pelicans are one of 2 teams that's never paid it. That factors into this, you know, and people are like, well, they should spend the money. It's like, yeah, of course they should, but they're not. So I've got to talk about it in the context of that.
Right. Absolutely. So when we come back, I want to talk about Brandon Ingram, the player, what he would look like, what he does on the floor. Does he fit with Cade, even if they were to go after him? We'll talk about all that when we come back. This Mother's Day, get something thoughtful for mom on DoorDash. Surprise her from wherever you are with fresh bouquets, the latest tech, gift cards, self-care treats, and more to make her day that much better. 50% off your next order, up to $15 when you spend $15 or more on your next flower, convenience, grocery, or retail order now on DoorDash. Pair flowers with a gift card so she can celebrate any way that she wants. Is she a bookworm? I know my wife is. She would absolutely love a bookstore gift card for Valentine's Day. I've done it before. I think if your mom's a bookworm, she would absolutely love it as well. Does she love a good latte? Get a gift card to her favorite coffee shop. My mom loves Starbucks. I got her one last year using DoorDash. Actually, I just sent her a Starbucks coffee using DoorDash, and she absolutely loved it. You cannot go wrong. Get all your Mother's Day gifts and all in one place, and get 50% off your next order, up to $15 when you spend $15 or more in your next flower, convenience, grocery, or retail order now with Locked On NBA. That's Locked On NBA. Order using DoorDash today. Terms apply with DoorDash. Then let me tell you about another one of our sponsors, FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. I've told you guys this many times. A few years ago when betting became legal in Michigan, I didn't know where to go. I wasn't familiar with it at all. I downloaded FanDuel. I haven't turned back since. It's super self-explanatory. It's a lot of fun. There's all kinds of things you can do on there. I still use it to this day. So again, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. So, Jake, obviously, one of the parts that has to be discussed is, okay, people are going to be available, but do any of them fit with Cade Cunningham? Would any of them be worth it? Is there any reason to actually do it outside, like you said earlier, playing fantasy basketball, just throwing stars on a team and throwing players on a team just because of their name? So I want to talk about Brandon Ingram's fit and what he does. More so, what does he do on a basketball floor so Pistons fans understand it? Before we hear from you, though, I do want to say this. There was a tweet I saw today that I quoted. It was from the same person I talked about earlier, from Shamit in the.
He literally just texted me, actually, while we're recording. Yeah, I just got a text from him.
You should let him know that he's giving me a lot of content stuff. He's helping me out. But
will do.
But he just so he tweeted this out today, because last episode I talked about Brandon Ingram a little bit, and this has caused like, if you see Pistons Twitter in the community, they're losing their minds. Like, everyone's talking about Brandon Ingram right now. And he tweeted out today. I'm assuming he's at the exit interviews, and he tweeted out that Brandon Ingram said on if the Pels should add a point guard, he said it would be helpful. He went on to say, B.I. mentioned a lot of his threes during his All-Star season were catch and shoot as a result of Jrue Holiday and Lonzo Ball. And if you go look at Brandon Ingram's numbers over the last few years, you see during his 2 best seasons, I would say, maybe I'm wrong, I'd love to hear from you. But
no, I already know what you're going to say, and yes.
Right, okay. So during his 2 best years, I would say he shot 6+ threes a game, and that was with Lonzo, and I think Lonzo was there both years, and Jrue maybe one of them. But and then after that, he's crashed down to not even 4 attempts from beyond the arc as well. So that kind of leads into what I want to ask you about. So what is Brandon Ingram, the player, like today? And kind of speak to that whole the issue with the 3-point attempts, because I know that's something I've watched you guys talk about a lot in the Pelicans community.
Yeah, I talk about this a lot on my show. That's the biggest mark against him is his shot selection does leave a lot to be desired, especially these past 2 years. You know, I find it a little bit interesting, and this is something that I'm going to be talking about on my show the next, this week, next week too, because we're going to have a lot of Brandon Ingram talk as well. You know, he mentioned that they came off catch and shoot threes. Look, they've run point Zion this year, and Zion dished the ball to him a lot, and he just wouldn't take those 3-pointers. And I really don't understand why. Part of it is he's a mid-range guy. He's very comfortable with that shot. That's what he feels his shot is. So you see him get a lot of catch and shoot opportunities and then dribble a couple feet in and then launch a mid-ranger that's contested and missed instead of actually taking the catch and shoot 3. It's an issue. The numbers that you mentioned is if you look at the past 4 or 5 years from him, the 3-pointers have basically gone down every single season. I think 2 years, they're basically more or less the same thing. That's not great, right? The Pelicans are a very good 3-point shooting team. He's a good 3-point shooter. He just doesn't do it consistently. And the Pelicans this year really tried to put more off-ball movement that was predicated around ball spacing, and it required Brandon Ingram to shoot threes, and he didn't do it. And look, to be honest with you, they abandoned the offense that they were running, in the beginning, a month or 2 into the season, because he just wouldn't fit in with that. And that's a bit of a problem, and it's a little bit of a head scratcher. And I think part of it is he likes to kind of be the guy. He just likes to go to those shots that he's comfortable with. And to his credit, he makes those mid-rangers at a higher rate than most people do. It still doesn't mean it's an efficient shot or a shot that you want like a ton of attempts from in your offense. That's the biggest knock on him. This is a dude who's a bucket getter though, right? Like he can go out and he can score. He's got great size. He can elevate and rise over a lot of people. He's actually very good at finishing at the rim when he decides to get to the rim. He's a willing playmaker and passer too. The Pelicans don't have a point guard. They kind of have point guard by committee. Maybe it's Zion's the point guard 50% of the time, and Brandon Ingram's the point guard 50% of the time. They're good. They're really good, like secondary creators. If you have someone else who has the ball, that if the ball gets to Brandon Ingram, okay, they can create. They get him the ball in the free throw line or the high post. He can create out of that a little bit. So pairing him with a guy like Cade makes a lot of sense if he's willing to play into that kind of style of ball and in a sense, like know his role and know his place. And that's something that didn't really get figured out this season with the Pelicans. And I think that's one of the reasons why you saw them lose their minutes when Zion was on the court, when CJ was on the court, when BI was on the court, when they all 3 of them shared the court together. The Pelicans lost those minutes. That shouldn't happen with that group. That's too much talent there to not be an effective lineup, no matter who the other 2 guys are. But they did because there's a little bit of a clunky fit there. And I think that kind of leaves Ingram as, and this is, can go and get you 30, 40 points on any given night. He can get you 7 assists, right? He's their leading assist guy. There's some issues with it, and I think that's why you're seeing this team be open to trading him.
So I'm just looking at his synergy chart here. I just want to read these numbers off for Pistons fans. By far, his most used play type this past season was a pick-and-roll ball handler, 396 possessions. He was in the 78th percentile. Next was spot-ups. He had 234 possessions as a spot-up shooter. He was in the 56th percentile. He had 180 isolation attempts. He was in the 56th percentile. Handoffs, 105. He was in the 88th percentile, which is excellent. As a catch-and-shooter, he was in the 52nd percentile. And unguarded catch and shoot in the 54th percentile. Off the dribble jumper, 63rd percentile. Around the rim, 67th percentile. So like you said, this is a dude who's just, he can score in a lot of ways. He can score in quite a few different ways offensively. Where I want to ask you is, or how I should say it is, what I want to ask you about is his playmaking, because I think something that gets confused is in the Pistons community is, do I think Cade could thrive with the heliocentric offense with just shooting around him? Yes, I would do. I think he would do great. I think there's a level of a belief within Cade as well in his camp that if you did that, they would be good. That Cade could lead you to success if you just gave him shooting and let him do his thing. I do think that there is a level of belief there. But I also know that Cade is open and completely willing to play off ball if there's a player to play on ball that he trusts that will actually provide value. Like he's not going to play off ball so Killian Hayes can go take shots. Like that's not going to happen. But I know that if he had good players around him, he'd do whatever is asked of him. He'd play off ball. He can play off ball. He can catch and shoot. He can cut. Like he'll do those things. My question is about Brandon Ingram's playmaking. How good of a playmaker actually do you think he is? Is he someone that, because Cade's a really good playmaker, do you think he could be a secondary playmaker within an offense, or do you think his playmaking is slightly overrated?
No, I think his playmaking's good. I think when you look at his assist numbers the past couple of years, like they've remained consistent. 1 year might be an outlier, but I think he's pushing like 3-4 seasons now. Let me pull the numbers up here. Averaging over 5 assists per game. Yeah, 3 years of over 5 assists per game. He's got a couple of years where he's got almost 6 assists per game. Those are really good numbers, to be perfectly honest with you, as a guy that's not like your primary dude all of the time. So I think he is a willing passer. One of the things you've got to look at, and it became very apparent in this playoff series against the Oklahoma City Thunder, though, that I think limits his playmaking and creation for others. That's something the Pelicans were lacking in this. He got locked down by Lou Dort. And Dort's an amazing defender. I underrated that guy big time watching him play in this series here. But does Brandon Ingram draw double teams, right? Does he draw 2 to the ball? And I don't know if he does because of that poor shot selection. If you're not drawing 2 to the ball, everyone else is being defended one-on-one. That's not a good way to create open shots for teammates, right? Because his shot selection kind of requires tough mid-range jumpers, teams are willing to let him get it. Just defend him one-on-one because he's not going to do anything that makes us need to throw 2 at him. Until he breaks out of some of that, that's going to be the one thing that holds him back from being like a significant playmaker in the NBA. He's capable of that, right? That's where you need to shoot threes and be a threat from there, where they got to stick someone out at you far away to create that spacing. That means you got to drive to the rim more and attack the basket more so that it gets opponent defenses rotating, because when they're in rotation, that's how you create open shots through ball movement. And I can promise you that's how Monty Williams wants to try and play with a lot of this. So you need him to do those things. Yes, he can do that. He's absolutely capable of doing that. For whatever reason this year, he did that less than he ever had before. Does that mean he'll do it again next season? I don't know. That's kind of the issue there. But I definitely think the playmaking is very strong with him. He's a willing passer. But you saw limitations to that in this series against the Thunder.
So my biggest takeaway from Brandon Ingram, from listening to you talk about him as a player and from the things I know about him, and some of the concerns Pistons fans have, is both him and Cade like to take mid-range shots. They both are better than average mid-range shooters. They like getting to that shot. They're good at that shot. And I understand why that's a concern for some fans. It makes sense. However, this is my pushback, and this is why I don't view it as much of a concern for these 2 reasons. One, we have 2 seasons worth of evidence where he shot over 6 attempts and shot really high from beyond the arc. So if you can get him to buy into shooting those threes, now obviously maybe it was a problem with New Orleans and maybe they couldn't get him to do it. So why would the Pistons be able to do it? Basically, like if the New Orleans,
easier said than done, to be perfectly honest with that.
Right. So if New Orleans, a winning team, wasn't able to do it, what makes you think Detroit would be able to do it? That's fair. Also, Cade Cunningham took a huge step forward with his 3-point shooting this past year. His 3-point shooting was a huge thing for him coming out of college. And as the season went on more and more and more, he started to take more dribble pull-up threes. He's never shot less than 5 attempts from beyond the arc anyways. But even as the season went on, he was getting to 6 attempts, 7 attempts, and a lot of stuff going from beyond the arc and getting 2 on ball over and over and over again. So my thing is, if you can get Cade to continue to raise his 3-point shooting, which I know he's going to, I know he's working on that. I know that's a part of his game that him and his camp are working on. They're going to improve that 3-point shot. They want to get more shots for him from there. If you can, 2 things. If you can get Brandon Ingram to take more threes, I think it would work fine. And also, I don't see the problem with having two guys on your offense that can score from all 3 levels. I view that as a positive. Having 2 guys on the floor that are capable of getting to the rim, scoring from the mid-range, scoring from deep, and is able to make for others, I think that's versatile. You want to have guys like that. But obviously, you don't want to have too many mid-ranges. Like you said, it's a math game. You don't want too much of anything. It's just like anything in life. You don't want too much of anything. So
I don't want too much money, man. There's certain, I want too many all-stars on my team. Right? I can think of some things I want a lot of. So let me ask you this. Say the trade is this: Brandon Ingram for Jalen Duren and Fournier, right? Because I think that he's got one more year. It's a team option. Like, I think that's a guy New Orleans wouldn't actually hate to bring in. So let's say they bring those two guys over. Leave the draft picks out of it for right now. Your starting lineup has Cade Cunningham, Brandon Ingram, and who's the other three guys in it?
So I would assume that Ausar would be at the 4.
Okay.
Or maybe he's at the 2. Maybe they run Cade, Ausar, Brandon Ingram, Simone Fontecchio at one of those spots, and then probably Hardenstein or Claxton that they're going. That I've heard that they're going to be pushing hard for in free agency.
Okay. So who's the shooter in that lineup?
Fontecchio.
Okay. Who else?
That's it.
That's a problem. Like, I will say that right now, that's a problem. The Pistons this year, whatever it is now, ranked 27th in three-point attempts at just under 32 per game. Is that lineup going to is that team, let's say, depending on who the bench is and other things like that, of course, but it's your starters are playing the majority of minutes, right? Is that team taking more than 32 threes per game or less?
Probably not. Probably less.
Can you win that way? That's my question to the Pelicans right now. The Pelicans are at a similar number. They took 32.6. You were 27. The Pelicans were 24. They're in that same number there, and we saw a lot of limitations in what that can do to your offense. So when you have two high-usage guys in Zion and Brandon Ingram that don't take threes, Zion doesn't take any, BIs have gone down, that really can hamper spacing. And that becomes a problem for your stars. That's going to make life difficult for Cade Cunningham. That's going to make life difficult for Brandon Ingram at that point if it's just Fontecchio who's more or less shooting threes. Something to keep in mind with it, right? When we look at it from like a team building perspective.
Definitely. And there's going to be, I think what you're bringing up is completely fair because all of the players that it seems like the Pistons will be rumored to be interested in or be capable of getting, they're going to come with risk. There's going to be risk with all of them. And these are the risks that you're going to have to consider here. I think that's why it seems like the Pistons are at least going to, I think, try to see if they can find a stretch 5 out there somewhere to start with them. Because we saw the numbers in the Pistons community, what Ausar looked like next to stretch 5s like Mike Muscala and Danilo Gallinari. Like those lambs dominated. And those aren't even like come on, like Muscala and Gallinari, they're both like 45,000 years old. Like, but they could simply space the floor. So they dominated in those minutes because Ausar was able to have a spaced out floor and it was great. So I think they're going to try it. The thing is it's hard to come by those guys. Getting those guys is harder than just saying it. So we'll see what happens, but definitely NBA's got it. Basketball is a very beautiful game, but it's also it comes down to a math game too. You can't take too many 2s and not enough 3s, you'll lose. Like that.
No, it really does, right? Like you can trade bucket for bucket then, but if they're making one that's worth a point more, you're both having great shooting nights. One team's going to win,
right? And you're gonna like OKC Thunder's coach says all the time. There's some things that you understand you're going to lose on, but you have to take advantages of other things. You have to be willing to have that trade-off. So if you're giving up 3s, there better be something else that you're really taking advantage of and betting on constantly winning night in and night out that will make up for that. Do the Pistons have that? We'll see what happens. When we come back, though, what would the contract look like for Brandon Ingram? Because he is on expiring. And obviously, there's a few people also who listened to the last podcast and got confused thinking I'm saying trade for Brandon Ingram on an expiring and just let him rock it out. Like, no. Like, you don't want, if you don't think that he's going to resign, you don't get that wink or extension or anything, you obviously don't just trade for him on a 1-year deal. But what would a long-term contract look like for Brandon Ingram? We'll talk about that when we come back. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You already talked about that. But there is so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much more to get. You get unique stickers. You can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, and hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now, free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on with Monopoly Go. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. I think a lot of the last segment is going to go over either really well or very, very badly in the Pistons community because there's so much. It's so toxic right now in the Pistons community when it comes to trading for players and who you're going to trade and does it make sense? Is it going to cap your ceiling long term? Like there's all kinds of, it's just so toxic right now. So I'm sure they're going to absolutely love everything we talked about last episode or this last segment and this entire episode, to be honest. So be ready. There might be a few angry Pistons fans that show up in your DMs as well. So just be ready for all that. Just giving you a warning.
Works for me.
All right, so Brandon Ingram is on an expiring contract. And obviously, like I said before, if you do trade for Brandon Ingram, you are doing so not for him to be a one-year rental and then move on. Like, if you were to trade for him, you are doing so with the idea of either a contract extension or a wink, elbow, nudge, like, hey, you're going to be, we'll re-sign in the offseason kind of thing. Like, you don't got that, you're not trading for him. So, the question that I have, and a lot of Pistons fans also are asking is, okay, let's say you trade for Brandon Ingram. What's that contract looking like? Because one of the concerns is the Pistons do have a lot of flexibility with their cap space. And I've been a big proponent that they don't need to be trying to make a championship team right now. Like that should not be the goal. Making a top 4 seed should not be the goal. Making a team that can compete for a play-in and take those steps, it should be what the goal is right now. And you can do that by having shorter term contracts for good players. So you have that flexibility long-term to still make that next step when you need to. So if you get a Brandon Ingram, obviously you're probably not doing a short-term contract. If it's not a crazy money-wise, you can still work around that. You still have plenty of flexibility to still build a team once you get to that point. I guess the question is what do you think? What are you hearing? What did the Pelicans community, before it became like, oh, we're probably going to trade them. What did the money sound like it was going to happen?
Yeah, so look, I don't think it's necessarily that they're going to trade him, right? Like, I don't think that's a guaranteed thing. I think the issue is, kind of what we talked about, that last fit with it all. But the contract makes this a little bit more interesting. He has 1 year left, so he isn't expiring at this point. And that's going to lower his trade value, right? That's, I think, something that's important in looking at all of this. You trade for a guy with 1 year left, like that's not great. And I guarantee you any team that tries to trade for him, he's going to go to and be like, I'm not signing an extension. I'm going to test out free agency. And that's going to lower offers coming in for New Orleans. And that maybe means the offers are so low that they're just like, screw it, we're going to keep him. What that could also mean is the most likely course of action is they offer him an extension. And if they're going to offer him an extension, this dude wants to get paid. He wants to get paid. Straight up, he wants to get paid. So you then have to kind of look at that with him. And so he's eligible for a 4-year, $208 million extension, which they could do on the first day of free agency. If the Pelicans offer him that, he will take it. It's an average value of over $50 million per year. That scares me a little bit for a player that has the limitations that we talked about in the last segment. You then can't trade him for 6 months. If that's the case, meaning they would have to get this deal done like the first day of free agency, and then it puts you in line for being able to trade him by the trade deadline this coming season. So if there's a deal to be done with the Pistons and the Pelicans, it might be in February of next year at the trade deadline, somewhere around there. I don't think he's going to take less than the max. I really don't. Even with this poor playoff showing, I don't think he's going to take less than the max, because could he get that money in a year? Is there anything he's got to lose? He's still young. He puts up good numbers. And there's something to be said for a young team like the Pistons getting a dude who's been to the playoffs a couple times, is a former All-Star, right? That eats, breathes, and lives basketball. There's no issue with this dude off the court at all. He just loves to hoop. That can be useful on a young roster, right? Can he bring some of that attitude with him there? I think those are things that he feels are going to kind of inflate his market in the future. So if the Pelicans give him that max, that's going to be the case, and then they'll trade him. I really struggle to see where a deal would get done before that extension is in place for New Orleans, just because the offers are going to be low. If the Pistons came in with Duren and their first round pick for the for Ingram and the Pelicans first round pick, I think they would jump on that sort of deal, because I don't know if you're going to get a better offer than that because of the contract situation. So he wants the max. So know that you're going to probably have to pay him 4 years, $208 million, more than what he's making, which I think is like 36-ish this year, something like that.
36 million.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. I'm not completely sure. Is the 208 the most, that's how much the Pelicans can offer, right?
That's a max on an extension. Yeah. So that's going to be any of his current team can offer him that right now while he's still under contract for 1 more year.
So if the Pistons were to trade for him, they could then offer him the same 4-year, 208.
Yeah, I believe so. That they, you'd likely do something like an extended trade or something like that. But like more or less, yes, that's what his next deal, the max is that it could be, I think, for any team.
Okay, so that would be around, let's pull it up. That would be around $50 million a year or not around, it would be 50.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, $52 million a year for Brandon Ingram, which does sound pretty expensive for Brandon Ingram. Let's go ahead and I want to pull up the Pistons salary cap sheet right now real quick. So next season, the Pistons, as of right now, and a lot of these names like Evan Fournier, Troy Brown Jr., or Quinn Grimes, James Wiseman, like a lot of these contracts are not going to be on the books next year once they renounce their rights. So it's going to go even lower than this. But as of right now, they only have $82 million committed to the team next year. And that's with, like I said, Evan Fournier, who has $19 million. So that take $19 million off that goes down to what? $63 million. You take off Troy Brown Jr., that goes down to 58. You take off the renounced rights of James Wiseman, I believe that goes down another 8. I'm not completely sure on the James Wiseman, though, so don't quote me on James. Either way, the Pistons have a lot of cap space, and they have a lot of long-term cap flexibility as well. Tate's probably going to sign that rookie max this offseason. That kicks in 2025, 2026. So 2025, 2026 would be the first year that you would theoretically have like 2 guys making $50 million a year on your books with Cade and Ingram. Do you feel comfortable having Cade and Ingram making $100 million at that point, where the salary cap, I believe, is going up to I don't want to say a random number because I might get it wrong, but it's.
Let me see if I can find it here.
With the way that's going, overall point is that something the Pistons would want to do? Again, that's something they really have to consider. $50 million is a lot of money to commit to Brandon Ingram, and I do think Brandon Ingram is a very good basketball player. I think he is an all-star caliber player. He's only a one-time all-star, but that doesn't mean you're not an all-star level player. There's a lot of guys like Jamal Murray. They don't make the all-star game, but he's clearly an all-star level player. I think Brandon Ingram is clearly an all-star level player. I'm very high on Brandon Ingram. However, do you want to pay him $50 million a year? That'd be tough. That would be tough. I think the same concerns that New Orleans is having about it would be the same concerns the Pistons would have for it. My thing is this. There is going to be, whoever the Pistons bring in, they are going to have to overpay. Whoever they bring in, They will be overpaying them.
I agree with that.
Where like you said earlier about dealing in realistic situations. Like, of course, if you could get a star for a good contract, absolutely go do it. But that's just not the reality that we're living in. If whoever the Pistons trade for, they are going to be overpaying for. So it's just a matter of, and I've said this a few times in the podcast, when you do overpay for that player, you want to make sure that's the player you believe in that could either, 1, build into the contract you give them, or 2, serves a purpose during that contract that will be worth it in the end. So would that be worth it with Brandon Ingram? I'm not sure. It's a tough question. I'm not sure how I would answer it.
Again, it depends on this comes down to a question of like, how do you want to use your salary cap space? And there's different schools of thought with this, right? The luxury tax threshold is right around $171 million. So as long as you're not hitting that, like you're good, right? Like you don't want to pay that tax for a bad team. You want to pay that for a team that's like really going to compete because look, smaller markets that maybe don't have some of the money that they want to commit to some of these rosters, you've got a time when you're going to do that. Again, it's a reality of the situation, but you've got to pay players. But do you want to tie up in your cap space for guys that don't work, or do you want to go a route that Oklahoma City did, right? They rented out their cap space for draft picks. They took on bad contracts, and you had to attach first-round picks. That was for a period of time where all the bad contracts got dumped because they kept their cap sheet clean. But here's the thing. That team lost for 3, 4, 5 years, right? They hadn't made the playoffs since Shea's second year in the league. And this is a guy that was becoming an MVP candidate. And they timed it kind of well. But they were bad, like straight up kind of bad the past couple of years because they weren't trying to win. But if they were, that would have been a problem. They went through a long 3-year rebuild that wasn't great. And it's really kind of 4. Because they got kind of lucky that first year that they had Shea, which was his second year in the league when they had Chris Paul. They were trying to be bad. They took on Chris Paul's awful deal at the time for first-round picks. Is that a better use of the cap space? It could be, but you're not going to compete. You're not going to get better next year. That takes its toll on a team. That takes its toll on a fan base. That takes its toll on a star player like Cade Cunningham. Cade wants to win. All of these guys want to win. And if you have a young guy that you can build around, it's figuring that out and what to do. And that can be a very difficult thing. So is it better to spend the cap space on Brandon Ingram, getting into the first round next year, getting bounced out? Is it better to just basically tank a season again, but get a bunch of other first round picks that maybe you could then use to get a guy that's a higher quality than Brandon Ingram is? You've got to kind of balance all of those things. And that's not always an easy scale to figure out where it is when it comes to stuff like that.
And the biggest problem, this is something I've talked about over and over and over on the podcast, is what renting out the cap space is what the Pistons should have been doing the last 4 years of the rebuild.
So that's the thing, right? Like you're probably, in my opinion, past that point where like at a certain point, you got to do something, right? This team hasn't made the playoffs in 5 years now, right? I was looking at it, is that right? Yeah, 5 years. At a certain point, like how much losing is too much and how nice is it just to get into the postseason? Look, the team I cover just got swept. I like to go into 2 playoff games in the Smoothie King Center and like seeing and being part of that atmosphere, right? Even the play in the past couple of years was fun. Sometimes you just got to do it, right? You're in the NBA. Not every team is going to win a title every year. There is some value in just making the playoffs or trying to go and compete. Yeah,
and look, like I said, the Pistons should have been doing what you said the last 4 years. It's been my biggest critique and the biggest reason why this rebuild, let's be honest, probably is not going to end up working. If it ends up blowing up in their face, this is going to be why, because they didn't spend the last 4 years accumulating assets. They went the complete different route and were terrible with their asset management. That's what's going to end up buying them in the rear end. Because now, like you said, I know for a fact they are past that point. You will not convince Cade Cunningham for the next 2 years to buy in on another. It's not going to happen. You can book it, write it down. It's not going to happen. It's just not.
Then it's like, then honestly, it's like, yeah, go get Brandon Ingram if you can get him, right? Like sacrifice a young player to go get a dude that's going to help you more immediately with that. Ingram's defense was like tremendously improved this year. Like I know I just spent the last segment we did before this one, like not sounding that high on him. He is still a very good player. He's a very good teammate, right? That's a guy who really tried hard on defense this year and dramatically improved on that side of the ball. And to do that in year 7, 8, whatever it is for him, I think is a pretty incredible thing and kind of speaks to him as a player and what he's willing to do. Then yeah, you've got to go and get a guy like this, right? You've got to use picks, assets to do it, because if you've got to compete, and again, this is the reality of the situation. If maybe this isn't the best move for him, but if this is what they're going to do, then they should do it.
And this last thing, and then we'll wrap up the podcast. My thing is, I don't believe, if the Pistons' next goal should be, let's try to get to 30. Let's try to get to 40 wins. Let's try to take the next step to being a competent team, a playing team. That should be the next goal. If Brandon Ingram can help you get there, then you do it. However, I don't agree that trading for a player like this or signing him to that contract should mean that, okay, now you're capped out at that first round exit. Now you can't do any other moves. As long as the Pistons are savvy with their moves And yes, you can trade for Brandon Ingram, give him his money, and then keep the stuff around that flexible. Keep your cap space long-term wise flexible. Still, you can still, okay, now we've reached the play-in. Now we have flexibility to now add on to this and take that next step now to the top. So like, you have to have a good GM. You have to be savvy about it. But like, I feel like if we just go around assuming, okay, well, you have a bad GM, it's not going to ever work, then it's not much to talk about then. Like, it's just going to fail anyways.
Yeah, I mean, there's also that side of everything with it.
It's as you can see, Jake, it's not fun right now. It's not a good situation, but we're hoping for the best. So let me know in the comments over on Twitter. Do you guys want to go after Brandon Ingram? Are you guys more encouraged to go after him? Are you more discouraged to go after him? Again, let me know in the comment section down below or over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. Thank you, Jake, for coming on, man. You guys can go check out Jake over on Twitter at NOLA Jake. You can also follow him, obviously, at Locked On Pelicans. Jake, again, like I said, he's one of my favorites over at Locked On. I appreciate you coming on, man. It was a lot of fun. I'm sure they all appreciate your insight on Brandon Ingram, a name that I'm assuming will be linked or rumored to the Pistons all offseason because of how aggressive they're going to have to be. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Hit that subscribe button to the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Till next time, peace out.